He floated back down because he wanted to share his key to the locks on the chains that he saw everywhere. But first he was stripped and then he was stabbed by faceless men. Well, fuckers, he still stands. And he still gives his love, he just gives it away. The love that he receives is the love that is saved. And sometimes it is seen a strange spot in the sky, a human being that's given to fly. This is episode 0 of the Forest Floor Mycelium Network. I am your host, Matthew Flansburg, and we start from the beginning, right? So chapter 0 is a dedication, mostly, perhaps an outline for future episodes. Nonetheless, we're going to capture a number of stories, and most of these stories I would consider them love stories, love of life, love of friendship, love of creation, love of the journey. And some of these people that I'm going to describe deserve to be talked about. The heroes of the world, right? And without the stories, their memory fades. And so, in many ways, this is a dedication, a tribute to a handful of people, some in more impactful than others, but all of them had their place and their time. And as I get older, and as they no longer exist in this world, a lot of the things that I learned from them need to be repackaged, reformulated for the new generations. The things that resonated, different games, different frequencies, but the same old stories, they're timeless. And the lessons there. Friends, we're going to talk about family, we're going to talk about mentors. And in truth, it could be considered a sin or a violation of code of some sort, to not recollect and not remember and not validate the meaning behind a lot of the influencing forces of my life and of all of our lives. Truly, you have these people as well. But before it's all said and done, we need to document a lot of these conversations, a lot of these memories. Ultimately, it'll define why we're doing what we're doing here, why we are creating this Mycelium network. At the end of the day, I think bringing like people with like experiences and perhaps like desires together in a focused community is really the ultimate goal of this podcast, is to get to know and understand the impetuses of why other people are choosing to go into the mushroom market in general. More importantly, the why. Why are they doing that? There's obvious reasons. There's an emerging market unfolding beneath our feet, especially here in Colorado, with current legislation leaning more towards the experimental side, more towards the what-if side of possibilities. So I would consider Denver, Colorado to be another instance of a supernova of ideas emerging from, not unlike Silicon Valley was and continues to be in some degree, but truly in its height, Silicon Valley in early 2000s, late 90s, till the crash in 2001. But at that point in time, it was an epicenter for like individuals in the tech community, and it was one of the more intoxicating experiences as being in that environment at that time in history. It was truly intoxicating. The amount of ideas, the amount of money, the amount of freedom, the feeling of all things are possible literally could be felt like electricity in the air walking in Mountain View back in the late 90s. Almost indescribable now with all of the economic depression that we've since experienced. But there was a collective understanding that everything was going to be okay, that we had the keys to our destiny in our hands as we were building the applications that a lot of people were building at the time that, have since been replaced and iterated upon. Nonetheless, Denver has a similar feel to it these days. A little bit different, coming out of all these holes that we've been in. But nonetheless, there's that same vibe, that same potentiality. And that is one of the driving factors of why we relocated here and we'll be launching officially in this state. It's the epicenter. So if Silicon Valley was Silicon Valley, what is Colorado? Mushroom Mountain? Why not? Go from the days of Silicon Valley to the days of Mushroom Mountain. We talk about what are the things that we liked about those days of Silicon Valleyism. Well, there was a collective understanding and a kind of interesting way to organize talent. And that was certainly through stock options and other sort of vis-a-vis quid pro quo systems in which employees, in some way, shape, or form, enjoy the benefits of working with a growing company. And I think over the past 20 years, 25 years specifically, I've seen the degradation of those types of collective programs, and most of those have now been replaced with the commoditization of these workers. And I find that to be quite shameful from a truly business standpoint. Now, knowledge will tell you that, this is a natural outcome of late stage capitalism, and logic's good for your head and data's good and all that stuff. But the current state of, I'd say, employee company relations is at an all-time low. And this is primarily due to the desires of the C-suite and the motivations that they have. And currently, there are very few motivations to collectively share things in specifics to switch kind of the focus on maximizing shareholder returns. Now, what's going to happen is, quite honestly, and there's going to be a swatch of unhappy people within the pool of talent, and they'll be stretched thin, but inevitably, these talented people will find a way. And I think this program will be highlighting a great number of these kind of self-made entrepreneurs in a new market. Let's face it, the mushroom market is an emergent one with analogs towards the marijuana industry, which I postulate most will fail in analog comparison. We can get into that later, future episodes. But what I mean by that is there's going to be certain tactics, certain strategies that people have formulated based on the unique circumstances of the marijuana market. And most of that has to do with growing. I can go into deep on that. Certainly at a future date we will. However, some of these strategies will be proven to be false leads in the sense that the analog will break, because we're going to discover that the methodology of acquiring mushrooms and the methods that are currently being practiced across the country are not quite analogous, and there's going to be some emerging opportunities that nobody has their eyes on right now, which is good. And that's good because people are going to be thinking in different directions. But let's get back down. Just a nonstop kind of process of getting these ideas in the right package, right? So, in truth, like the manifestation of things really does start with the thought, and then it moves to the word, and then it manifests into action. Pretty simple mechanism, right? Thought, word, action. Now, really advanced people just go to thought, action. But I think the illustrative point of this is the word has power. Thought has power, word has power, action has more power. This is analogous to a lot of kind of religious systems, right? It's also analogous to how Olympic athletes project themselves into a winning state, project themselves onto the gold medal table or whatever hierarchy they see themselves achieving that goal. But it starts with the thought, right? And then the word, I'm going to do this, and then they do what they do. They put something into action. So that's kind of a fundamental, ultimate great starting place to, instead of showing you the product of the last, year, and quite honestly, that's 25 years of thought. We start with the kind of basics, like what are those thoughts? Like what are the basic impetuses? What are the basic driving factors of why we do why we do the things that we do? I think a lot of us have guiding lights, and certainly we have standards and certain things. Really good companies have these things manifested physically in statements and in kind of ways of encapsulating the idea, right? But what are the importance of these values in business? We're going to really get into that because I think they're probably the most valuable thing in business, and it really would help to differentiate this concept of mercenaries and missionaries in the business space. And let's be clear, my assessment of reality is just that. It's just my assessment of reality. Yours is definitely going to differ. We all have different perceptions, right? Which leads to different kind of thought processes and things like that. But let's just say that from a basic framework, whatever we think turns into words we use and results into actions that we take. So it really does begin with the thought, the beginning of the reasons why. Now, if people aren't deep in thought and they're into a lot of words, and if they're into a lot of action without that thought, that typically can be problematic. All action, no thought. Whereas all words, no action has also a bleak place in reality, right? So ultimately here, I think what I am trying to describe is a pathway to manifestation. And I'm not talking about, pulling things out of thin air. But I think manifestation in truth is finding our purpose, because there is a purpose for us to be here. I think that's the first real step in taking the bigger leap into the unknown is realizing that you could have a purpose. And then I think the next step is finding that purpose, and then the following after that is achieving what that purpose is, right? And then and keep moving forward. And that's the one thing I like about mushrooms in particular. They allow things to move forward, philosophically and in action. Philosophically, mushrooms are this kind of absurd hybrid organism thing that's different, right? It has different respiration properties similar to animals, similar to plants. It grows out of the ground similar to a plant, but genetically it's a lot like an animal. But then it's got these other qualities that are completely unique. And a lot of mushrooms, live in places where they are needed to further the ecosystem. And what we found, and this show will definitely have some of these programs on, there's one that comes to mind that was introduced to me in 2016 or 2017 by a friend of mine, Melinda. And I listened to it on the way out of Santa Cruz, and it was Tree to Shining Tree, but I forget the name of the podcast, and I'll be sure and link it. It's fantastic. But it was one of the first podcasts to really kind of shine the light on what that white stuff is when you're in a forest and you kick over some dirt. And that really opens up a wormhole of understanding that typically lies beneath us and goes unnoticed. It's a great podcast. I'll be sure and share it. It's just fantastic. What it'll do is allow you to look at mushrooms and the mycelium network that actually exists in a whole new way. You'll understand that there's a barter economy of sorts between different species of trees, plants, and actually living organisms that become part of this symbiotic ecosystem. Which is fascinating. I mean, without these mushrooms, some say that all of the pulp, all the swampy bark and celluloid material would have caused bogs and like forever swamps everywhere in the world had not fungus helped break down those things, decompose those things, and turn it into the next stage. And the circle of life then can complete itself within a forest. And it's within that forest, in that floor, that we find ourselves. It's the perfect place for mushrooms. So why mushrooms? Certainly, if I am starting a podcast and alluding towards dedicating my life towards mushroom-related things, what's the gig? What's the reason? What's the purpose? What's the why? So to understand that, I have to go back in time a little over 25 years ago, October 1997, October 9th, I believe, a Thursday. And I got called out of my mathematics methods for physicist class. And there was only a handful, maybe 6 to 7 of us in that class. But police officer was at the door. It was my fairly early morning class, 9:30, 10 or so. Officer at the door of our physics room asks to see me, and I joked to my buddy next to me, I think it was Austin Godber, I said, I think they're here for me. And I was thinking of something totally unrelated. I was thinking of something to do with a car or something else, but had nothing to do with what I was about to experience. And so I went outside in the hallway with the officer and said, I'm like, what's going on? They said, somebody's at the hospital. You need to go. And initially, I thought it was my grandmother. And then I quickly figured out they wouldn't have called me out of class for that. So I had about, I don't know, half an hour to get to the heart hospital, like emergency room thing that I was directed to go. A kid in my class took me. I couldn't tell you which one took me at this point. I just remember my head was out the window. And just looking at the side, wondering what the heck. We get to the hospital. They tell me my dad's had a heart attack. Say he's been gone for about an hour and a half. And they asked me, said, "Do you want to go see him?" I said, "No." I had his birthday was a couple of weeks earlier. I had dinner with him the night, a couple of nights before. I said, "No, I had dinner with him. I want to remember that. I want to remember him that way." I'd later regret that decision for a number of years due to the nightmares I had. That there's a story about elephants. So, if an elephant dies outside of its environment, like in captivity, they found that it's really therapeutic for the other animals to get some sort of validation that they've gone, some sort of physical representation or acknowledgement. Because what ended up happening was I get these bizarre, nightmares where my father would show up, and this is still pretty early stages after this, so there's a lot of doubt that he was even dead in my dreaming states, right? And so I'd have these moments where I'd just be naturally having a conversation with him in a dream, and then it would just come crashing down, and I'd be like, "You can't be here. Like, you're not allowed to be here. Not supposed to be here. You're dead," And he'd get really upset. Like, "What are you talking about?" And it was just really this uncomfortable situation once my daytime reality would hit my dream state. And so I struggled with that for quite a bit. And I have no advice for anybody on this subject, but I do wonder what would have been like had I gone in there and actually witnessed him in that state, right? Gone. I didn't. So I think it manifested in these great dreams that turn into nightmares. There's another way to describe it. However, we're getting to the purpose. That was a pretty rough time for me. And one of the only friends that actually didn't spend time with my dad was my friend Daniel. But Daniel at that time lived down the street. And as a consequence of my father dying, I couldn't maintain my class load. I was the only son of the only son of the only son, and the only son and the only son of the other side of the family. So I have this kind of legacy of only child. And he was, I was the only kid. He was my dad. He's my hero. He's my number one guy. So not to get off track, I suppose. When your number one guy goes, yeah, it's not easy, especially when they go at 51. But nonetheless, Daniel, sorry, that's the worst thing I need to take out is that word nonetheless, and I'll do my best to try so. Daniel lived down the street. I had to drop out, deal with the, estate stuff, so to speak. There's no money involved, just, these things happen. People have to move out of their stuff. I had storage units. I was the only guy, right? So I had to deal with this stuff. postpone my degree another year because the classes I were taking were so specialized that, they weren't available until the following year, right? Not the semester, the following year, because they're either back to back, complex math stuff. So anyways, I had to drop out, which actually, in retrospect, may have saved me in so many different ways on a different track. But the funny thing, the funny thing is the discovery. And so there's this company called Sporeworks. And they've been around since 96, 97, right? And the reason we know this is because they had an ad. They had an ad, and it had to have been the High Times magazine. And you'll find, you'll get to know that I'm a guy who experiments with stuff. Used to experiment with rockets and explosives, and moved into drugs and guns and fast cars. Just fun stuff, right? Like the stuff the fun stuff. The dangerous stuff. The stuff you're not supposed to. In truth, it was just, I didn't handle it correctly. I didn't have the coping skills. And if you don't have those coping skills, and you don't have a lot of family, and you really don't have a lot of discipline, really, and you've got heroes like named Bukowski, and you got friends that are hilarious, that you'll find you can't trust them, but you love them, and they're like the best friends you've ever met. You go on these adventures, and you have this kind of, you have a different perspective. But at this time, it was not a good one. This time was pretty miserable. At the time, I don't know who initiated the thought. It was Daniel and myself. I couldn't tell you. But yeah, we decided, all right, we got to figure this thing out. We got to figure out, let's grow some mushrooms. So, okay. Time to put our brains to work. So we were afraid to have the mushrooms mailed to us, right? The mushroom spore syringes. So one of our friends, Dave Dick, who recently passed away, Dave, this one's for you. This is just a typical Dave Dick move. And I swear to God, his name's Dick. It's not a nickname. His name is David Dick. Dave Dick's a looker. The girls loved him. Like, this guy had his game on lock. I don't even think he liked Dave Matthews, but he knew that the girls liked Dave Matthews. And he knew his odds were better picking concerts that the girls liked. So, Dave would have never gone to like Danzig or Metallica with me. Sure as shit though, he's got he's got the right tickets in the right rows where he can actually talk to girls and they can hear him. And that's Dave. Dave's one of these guys. So Dave convinced, we tell Dave the problem, like, we need to get these Daves in, right? Dave's not going to participate in any of the, the mechanization or the construction, or he's not going to contribute to any of this, right? But he'll sure shit, he'll cheer us on. And if he can find a task that he can do, he'd be more than willing to help us out. And so, of course, we're like, Dave, we need to get these syringes. Like, well, where are we going to send them? He's like, I know the perfect two. There's these two girls, and God bless them. I can't remember their names. I have a terrible memory. But their nickname back in the day, back in the mid to late 90s in Tempe, were the Nose Twins. And these are two really good looking girls, and were really, really pretty. And they both had big noses, and they're like sisters, but they weren't sisters, but they had large noses. And a friend of mine named Colin gave them the moniker the Nose Twins, and inside it stuck. They're really pretty girls, but it was hilarious. Anyways, so Dave goes over the Nose Twins, and this is a common haunt back in Casey Moore's. This is back in the day where there was really one bar in Tempe that the kind of outcasts of the normal community would really propagate to, right? There were the things where there was functions that, let's say the alpha crowd, the fraternity crowds, right? Alpha, beta, chi, whatever. That crowd had they had their lines in Tempe, right? Casey Moore's wasn't their line. That wasn't their place. In fact, a couple times people crossed into that line, and it really didn't end well most of the time for the guys coming in. It just wasn't a fit, right? It just there wasn't. This was more of a, if there were beatnik poets and they only had one place to hang out back in the 90s, it would have been Casey Moore's in Tempe, if there were beatniks, right? Say there was a different atmosphere there. It was a different group, but it was a tight group. And for years, it was populated by the same type group and the same bartenders. And it was the most entertaining place on the planet. No joke. With my friends at that place, I've laughed more and had more enjoyable interactions than probably any other place on the planet. And equally, I've had some terrible interactions there, right? It's a bar, right? Ultimately, my youth was way too much fueled by alcohol. The irony of all of that is that I can't tell my younger self, hey, like, I've talked to this. I talked about this scenario. It's like the Jean-Luc Picard scenario. Go back to my younger self, 12 years old. Buddies opened up my parents' liquor cabinet saying, let's drink some of this. I'm like, oh, my parents, but whatever, right? Let's go for it. Started drinking at 12, right? And this wasn't like whatever, but yeah, I started like hitting the booze when I was 12. It was fun. It was great, right? Was it great? Yeah. You look back on it, you're like, oh man, I wonder if I would have done this different, done that different. These things kind of add up. And you have your whole like first half of your life turn whatever age you think half is. First half of your life comes around, you're like, oh, wait a second here. Things kind of been a little bit different. So you quit, you do what you want. I mean, you make decisions, you decide, one day you wake up, you say, you know what, today's the day. I don't fucking care. I don't think alcohol is working. And whatever mechanism you go through for that, however you maintain that, that's on you. That's cool. For me, it was just like right before my grandmother died, I had this thing like, why even drink at all anymore? It's like not even enjoyable, right? So for me, I was like, you know what? Maybe I drank the sauce so much, I figured out what it was. So it doesn't appeal to me anymore. And sometimes I wonder, was it the mushrooms? Partly, right? Was it the mushrooms? So how did we get to the mushrooms? So Dave convinces the Nose Twins, like, everything's cool. We're going to have a package sent to your address. Okay. Ball in motion, right? And so Daniel and I, now it would be absurd for someone to say, here, take this pill. You won't feel any pain. It's not going to actually cure your broken arm. You're going to play tennis every day, but you're not going to feel it. All right? Mask it with something every day, but not cure the problem. So what if there's a class of drugs or experiences out there that are kind of hit it, quit it, move on? Reset drugs, right? So what if there was a class of drugs out there that reset your body in one motion? It doesn't pump you full of things every day to maintain a different level. It resets something. Those are two functionally different things. So having intimate familiar with depression my entire life, genetics, circumstance, whatever, probably a bunch of things, right? But having experienced that over long periods of time, traditional drugs, just the concept of them sucks. Period. I need to take this in order not to feel that way, right? And so I think, in truth, a lot of people are hoping for and would desire a reset solution, right? So let's walk back in time. 1997. I can't tell you, in truth. Daniel might remember. I at this moment in my time, I don't remember if we initiated the mushroom grow before or after my dad's death. I know I know the house that we did it in. I know my roommates. I remember the entire process. I mean, I remember having arguments with my roommate. She was not into it. At that point, I didn't really care, right? My dad was, I was like, fuck it. She got over it. But it was funny, her reaction. It was the 90s, right? And so this is the Wild Wild West, where the Wild Wild West was mail order catalogs, right? I swear to God. So let's get back to the story. We wanted to grow mushrooms. All the heavy lifting was going to be done by Daniel and I. We were going to do the research, we're going to figure out how to make this happen. So one of the constituent ingredients is, of course, spores. Now, this company, Sporeworks, they're in Tennessee, I believe. Pretty positive they are. We had no idea at that time, legality or tracking, or if this was a setup, or, all these things go through your head when you're in college. But it was a mail order catalog of sorts through the High Times, or either New Times, or whatever the equivalent there is, in Phoenix New Times, right? Could have been that magazine, could have been High Times. But there's the article, like, buy spores. So to this day, spores are legal to buy. As long, this is where my interpretational law, and don't take my interpretational law as law and say, hey, this guy said this. It doesn't matter what I think. You need to figure this out yourself. And in truth, I've talked to a number of lawyers on legality boundaries, I would call them. And it seems that the boundary is anything with live mycelium seems to be questionable. So if you sell spores that are, seed-like, like in a solution, that's been going on for nearly 30 years now, folks, believe it or not, in the United States and internationally too. Netherlands has a great open system too. So there's a lot of countries you can trade spores all day long, regardless of species, type, whatever you want to call them. However, that the line crosses with live mycelium. So in '97, we were honestly legally able to obtain spores, but as a layer of precaution and obfuscation, we were a little nervous. And so Dave basically convinced the Nose twins that we had a package that needed to be delivered to their house, which is about 2 blocks walking from ours, and they were totally cool with it because it was Dave. So we threw them under the proverbial bus retrospectively, but they had complete plausible deniability. I think we even fudged the name or something. So a few weeks later, of course, Dave has been checking on the Nose twins. Maybe that was his thing the whole time. I'm telling you, the guy was a hidden genius. God. So I think I figured out how Dave benefited from this even more. So Dave would check on the Nose twins every day, and he eventually got the package, right? So spores came. At that point, Daniel and I had gone, and I don't remember, at the top of my head, I forget the tech name. But vermiculite, brown rice. We built rice cakes with basically jars. We sterilized the jars and then injected the top, with spores and put them in a cool area. Just really basic old school, literally old school. And the first machine that Daniel and I built was actually not so bad. Had a timer and everything. But it was basically just a cooler, right? A humidity cooler with a cycle of humidity, humidifier hooked up to it, a timer, and it had a series of looped 2-gallon, if I can recall, 2-gallon soda cans to loop in, and that would collect moisture, excessive moisture. And so, we had a nice clean humidity system. We found a great closet at a undisclosed location. And so we initiated the process. It is actually way more successful than probabilities would typically dictate. So I think it was retrospectively, we got really lucky, in truth, because we didn't know what the heck we were doing, right? Maybe it's because we were overly cautious. That could have been it too. We really kind of went the whole full mile, which, if you go the full mile with like protective gear, sterilization, and you really are mindful of the entire process, uh, and the location where you're doing these processes, you can really increase your chances by being careful. I mean, in truth, and just mindful. Biological, medicinal effect that would be more akin to a reset. I think we're all very familiar, especially Americans are all too familiar with the subscription model. It starts with a prescription, right? They prescribe you something, and that the most profitable model for the pharmaceutical companies by far is to charge you a daily fee, as much money as they can, to not actually solve the problem, right? Right. If the drug solved the problem, all their money in research and time spent advertising it would evaporate, right? Because the problem would go away and people would be cured. So there is zero incentivization in the American subscription model for that kind of absurd approach of actually solving problems, right? So if I told you there was a class of drugs out there that have existed and been used by humanity since the birth of consciousness, you'd probably be interested, right? Surprisingly, no. People are scared and confused, and no wonder. We've had leaders like Nixon who completely threw away decades of research and progress in favor of an ignorant authoritarian standpoint. And we can dive totally deep into that and look at the facts on that. Or we can look at the more subversive and far more damaging approach, which was a moralistic approach in the 80s, started by Nancy Reagan. I shouldn't say started by Nancy Reagan. She had very little to do with it, but she was definitely the figurehead. And there's nothing worse than a moral figure dictating legislation without any true depth, right? Policies such as say no to drugs, when the entire current of the medical design, the designed medical model is drugs. It's absurd. Say no to drugs. There's not a single person that I know that doesn't take drugs in some way, shape, or form. It's absolutely absurd. It's how you want to perceive those, sure. Lean towards, if somebody tells them it's okay, then it's okay, and if the authorities tell you it's not okay, then it's a moral or ethical issue. Whereas it's just their own mental slavery to a system in which they buy into, which is fair. They want to buy into that system. It's reinforced by a lot of people. However, the outcome, as we know, is just more of the same. More of the same. And in today's society of profit over people, it's not surprising, it's just here we are. So the funny thing is, the disease caused by this kind of thinking, or the outcome of these kinds of thinking, just make the soil ripe for alternatives. It is where the capitalistic system eats on itself, right? This is an Ouroboros type of scenario where they take so much money and give so little in return that cheaper, viable opportunities can completely undermine their entire model itself. Like, just take, for instance, like the damage to the market that if let's say something like depression was cured. I'm not saying there's a cure out there. I'm not suggesting the mushrooms are that. I'm just postulating that what would happen if everybody was magically cured of depression and it didn't exist in its current forms, right? Like, for some reason, there's a connection in the brain. You take this thing, whatever that is, and you've transformed in such a way that you no longer need the daily regimen of synthetic things or whatever you're taking to kind of counteract the, the environmental or behavioral, whatever pressures exist, right? You're able to deal with those without the use of these crutch drugs, these subscription drugs, and you're able to move on. The market, there's a lot of money to be lost, right? There's like systems in place, like there's, and this would be the argument for the candle maker argument, where, you know, somebody invents the light bulb and the candle makers get together and they say, and they get legislation behind them saying, listen, this is going to put all of us out of business. We got to put legislation that prohibits the use of light bulbs because we have entire structures involved for, like, you know, candles, and everybody's been using candles forever. So like we can't just allow this light bulb thing to destroy industries. Now, if you read books, this is a direct reference, but if you put in legislation to protect the candle makers, you're doing more damage than good, right? Because, you know, that's called competition, and that's called ingenuity and stuff like that, creativity. But this is where things like fights for oil in free market economies against solar, right? There shouldn't be subsidies on either side at this point at all, period. There shouldn't be. These are standalone businesses, proven viabilities across continents. So they should be working in a free market economy, as should all of these other things coming out. So, of course, I believe there's a correlation, and Johns Hopkins will get into deeper studies, and we're going to dive into those in later episodes, on just this, like efficacy with depression. And we're going to talk about mushrooms and stuff like that. There's also other things like alcoholism, post-trauma stress. There is a number of things, ADHD, obsessive compulsive disorder. There's a lot of specific behavioral and whatever you want to call them, say manifestations of societal problems, right? Like whatever those are. I think a lot of everybody's experiencing anxiety and stuff like that. So there's this kind of collective diseases kind of being spread, so to speak, just through anxiety, depression, uncertainty, blah, 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 blah. But then there's individual instances of certain types of suffering. And so traditionally these things have been tackled, and, you know, we've got the best drug companies in the world, and they've got the biggest budgets in the world, and they've got the, you know, the best and brightest in the world. So you would expect these companies by this point to be making breakthroughs, right? And to really be creating new classes of drugs that actually are efficacious, but they're not, they can't be designed that way. It's crazy, right? Imagine that. Imagine being a really bright scientist, like, and you come up with a great drug and you're like, hey guys, guess what? I just cured blah, blah, blah. And the company you work for is like, that's great. Never talk about it, right? We're going to buy this thing. This is, you know, or, and I've experienced this firsthand. Actually, I should say I experienced this secondhand, but this is the experience that I witnessed. Pharmaceutical company, I won't name them because I don't remember their name, which is good. But anyways, pharmaceutical company has a cheap drug that's being used in third world countries. I think it's a malaria drug. It could be something similar. But, and I will get the details on this if people are really interested in the studies, and I will pull them, and I'll have my guy pull the official study that really upset him, but shined a light really on the state. So, pharmaceutical drug has this drug. It's like, I don't know, 26 cents a vial, super cheap, but it does great things. Kids with a certain kind of cancer, neuroblastoma, that were taking this drug, there was a large spike in instances where the neuroblastoma cancer stopped in its tracks, was paused, and they correlated it with this drug, this cheap drug. So my friend's child died of neuroblastoma. His foundation has raised quite a bit of money in his memory to fund research and stuff like that. So these are the kind of you get these announcements down the pipe. You're like, oh, this is cool. This has promise to help, cure cancer this is from my friend's perspective. This is a type of drug that has promise to cure cancer, or at least has promise in doing some kind of interaction with the cancer that killed my kid. So this is something I'm interested in. He reaches out to the pharma companies, and by the way, my friend's a lawyer, and a very good one at that. He's a very talented litigator, but more so, he's a vivacious reader, very persuasive, and he's got all the markers of true talent. Ever since I've met him, nonetheless, stand-up dude. He reaches out to the pharma company and says, "Hey guys, this is great. It's a cheap drug. I'd like to study this under this guise and stuff like that." And if I remember correctly, I can get the true details on this, that you think that there's a correlation there. We need you to give us, and it was some absurd amount of money. It was millions of dollars. You need to give us absurd amount of money so that we can look into this and do some kind of this, that, and what so to validate it. However, we retain all of the discovery, it's the wrong term, but everything that they find out, they own. And that's all their IP, all their knowledge. And basically what they were saying is that the foundation needed to give them a bunch of money so that they could validate validate the correlation, but that there was no intention or obligation to do anything about it. It was really disturbing. You would think, a normal human being would think, this is kids with cancer, right? I go to somebody and say, "Oh my God, this is absolutely amazing. I imagine, somebody you cared about died. This, and for 26 cents a vial, like, this could stop another kid from dying." You'd think that would be of like paramount importance. You'd think, right? I mean, that's what normal human beings would think. That this is a very important moment, right? Like, guys, like, I mean, I see like bursting into the house, like, "Hey, this drug, which costs 26 cents or 28 cents, whatever it was, seems to stop cancer in certain kids with this type of cancer. Isn't that why we saved our money up? Isn't that why we raised money, is to put things towards that, right? And then have some sort of outcome or predictable like result that involves some sort of cooperation to help these kids, right? Some sort of like, oh, wow, holy shit, puzzles are being put together. Let's solve the problem." But no, it's like kind of like the Vatican telling people to donate, and then you go to the Vatican and they've got more money than they know what to do with. Like, literally could solve world hunger for, the next 500 years. Yeah. Disappointment, I think, is a great word. I would go as far as to say that's morally questionable. And, I believe in a free market economy. However, like, what the fuck is that? Is that the free market economy that you want? Is that the world in which we've become accustomed to, which is normal behavior from a non-living, breathing, but entity, like a corporate entity? Like, this is how corporate entities are allowed to behave. They're all run by people, by the way. So, of course, the person behind the letter didn't have any personal responsibility in turning down helping kids with cancer. Of course, that was some sort of executive decision above him. And he, of course, there was no responsibility, right? There's obviously no evil guy in the room saying like, "Hey, we can't help kids with cancer." I mean, nobody's having those conversations because they're getting filtered through a system where that never comes up because it's a non-issue, right? It's just like that's not why they're in business. It's not why they're in business, right? Their business is not in solving problems. Their business is not in solving cancer, right? I mean, listen, ad campaigns can tell people something the opposite about what a company's doing, right? But in truth, you've got to really look at what's going on And you wonder why healthcare is so pitiful in the United States. Like, I mean, really the funniest quote is Russia is finding out why the United States doesn't have good healthcare, right?